Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled The Science and Power of Hope. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Chan Hellman. Dr. Hellman is a professor at the University of Oklahoma and director of the Hope Research Center. His research is focused on hope as a psychological strength, helping children and adults overcome trauma and adversity. He's published more than 100 studies. Dr. Hellman is also the co-author of the award-winning book, Hope Rising. In today's webinar, we will discuss what hope is and why it matters. According to research, hope is one of the strongest predictors of well-being. It's also a strength that can be taught to both children and adults. Hope can influence positive outcomes and even help us regulate our emotions. Today, we'll learn all about the core components of hope, and we will hear strategies to implement a hope-based framework in our lives. First, we'd like to begin today's webinar with a poll question to our live audience. One of the first steps to cultivating hope is setting goals that are personally important and then mapping pathways to achieve those goals. We're wondering, what is one big goal for you or your child in 2024? If you don't see your goal, please let us know in the comments what it is. And then on a scale of 1 to 5, how hopeful are you right now that you will achieve your goal? Please select your answers and just use that text box under the video player to tell us more. In the meantime, for answers to common webinar questions about slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance, just click on the FAQ tab at any time on your webinar screen. Here at ADDitude, we have just closed a really tremendous spring issue of the magazine with insights from our exclusive survey of 11,000 readers on ADHD treatments, which ones work best for them, and the biggest barriers to care. To read this all yourself, visit additudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine now, or you can click the magazine tab on the screen to learn more. And we know that a common goal among readers is decluttering. If this is you, we encourage you to check out ADDitude's ebook, Declutter Your Life. This resource features ADHD-friendly hacks for purging, organizing, maintaining a clutter-free home, and prioritizing activities and relationships above stuff. Click the link on your screen or visit additudemag.com/shop for details. Okay, without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Chan Hellman. Dr. Hellman, thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this really provocative discussion about hope.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to get to discuss this sort of introductory to the science of hope. As mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm a quantitative psychologist by training. And the reason I like to highlight that focus on my academic training is because the science of hope has been very, very important to me. So for the last 25 years, I've been doing work predominantly evaluating outcomes of program services in pretty high trauma and adversity related areas like domestic violence, child maltreatment, homelessness, food insecurity. And it was roughly 15 years ago that I was introduced to this concept of hope. And 15 years ago, I was invited to conduct a housing needs assessment for an organization. And this organization provides services to those living with HIV and AIDS. And I was fortunate enough to get to meet a young man who was 19, a young man named David. And David and I had about a 7 or 8 minute conversation that changed my life, both personally and professionally. David shared with me, of course, that he was 19 years old, but more specifically that 3 months earlier, he learned that he was HIV positive. Now, when David shared this with me as a psychologist, but also as somebody who evaluates programs, the first thing that came to my mind was what must be wrong. Given the adversity that he was experiencing, I began to think about things like depression and anxiety. As I continue to talk with this young man, he shares with me that 2 weeks earlier, he had disclosed to his parents that he was HIV positive. They'd kicked him out of the house, and he had spent the last 2 weeks homeless in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I live. Now I'm listening to David at this point, and I'm also thinking about social isolation and, all of these adversities that he's experiencing. But in that moment, David shifted the conversation. And as I mentioned, he changed my life both personally and professionally. In particular, David began to talk about the future. He shared with me that while experiencing the adversity associated with being newly unhoused, trying to survive during this time, he had also made his way to the local community college. He had met with an academic counselor, had enrolled in his first semester of courses, and declared a major. And it just struck me in that moment, 15 years ago, that I'd spent my entire life focused on this idea of what's wrong with you as a psychologist, understanding the adversity that individuals experience and the psychological impact that that typically has. But what David shared with me is that there's probably a better question. And that question is, what is right with you? What is the strength that David possessed? What is the strength that could be nurtured, that can help people navigate through trauma and adversity? And that was really my introduction to this concept of hope. And I've spent the last 15 years dedicating my life to understanding what is hope and why does it matter in our lives? How does trauma and adversity influence our capacity for hope? And then more importantly, what are the simple strategies that individuals can use to nurture and restore hope in children, adults, and families? So today I'm going to discuss really a summary of the last 15 years of that research and work. This research has culminated into a curriculum and a training that we use to work with state agencies, with nonprofit organizations, with school districts, in an effort to promote the science of hope, where hope is not the outcome, but well-being is always the outcome, and hope is the process. So one of the things that I'll try to navigate through today in our time together is to demonstrate that hope is a framework for action. Hope and the science of hope gives us very simple strategies to nurture well-being in children, adults, and families. Now, on this particular slide that you can see are typical responses that people might have when experiencing adversity or trauma. So for instance, one of our publications demonstrates that when somebody is experiencing adversity, it reduces their capacity to trust others. We also look at things like shame, guilt, rumination. And one of the things that we find is that these things, these experiences to adversity, reduce our capacity for hope. So one of our recent publications demonstrates that that adults, when they were children and experienced tremendous adversity, experience a higher rate of ruminating on the past, which diminishes hope. So the work that I've been focused on and the curriculum that we're working towards is really about how do we interrupt these trauma or these types of psychological responses to nurture and restore hope. Now, my personal philosophy is that everybody has a role to play in nurturing hope in children and adults. And so what we want to make sure we're doing is creating strategies that are accessible to everybody, to teachers, to parents, to coaches, to youth ministers, but to everybody who has a role to play in the lives of children and families. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. What I will tell you is that I'm going to periodically ask you some questions to get you to reflect and perhaps participate or engage a little bit in the conversation. But the basic idea is we're going to look at what is hope and some of the basic strategies around nurturing this hope. So the first thing I would like for you to think about is when you hear the word hope, when you think about this word, what comes to mind? What do you associate with hope? And feel free to put that into the chat or the question area if you can. But typically some of the things that I'll hear are future, things can be better, positivity, for instance. So let me ask you a second question to reflect on. Is hope a feeling? Is it an emotion that we have? Or is hope a way of thinking? Is it a cognitive process? What are your thoughts on that? Is hope a feeling? Is it emotion? Or is it a way of thinking? And so looking through sort of the responses, what we do is we treat hope as a way of thinking. And this is the simple definition. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that we have the power to make it so. So a few things about this particular slide. Now, the reason that we treat hope as a cognitive process, as a way of thinking, is because if hope was an emotion, if it was a feeling that you and I had, then really at best we'd be able to help people manage those feelings. But because hope is a way of thinking, that it is a cognitive process, we know it's something that can be taught. So again, here's the definition. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that you have the power to make it so. So a couple things about that definition. If hope was simply the belief that the future would be better than today, and we stop there, that's really optimism. That's an optimistic expectation that the future will work out. But hope goes beyond optimism by the latter part of the definition. That is that you have the power to make it so. So in this way, hope is about taking action to pursue that future. And that's a distinction between hope and optimism. Now, one of the things that I really love about this concept of hope is how simple it actually is, the simplicity of hope. Hope is based upon three simple ideas: goals, pathways, and willpower. Now, goals are the cornerstone of everything that we do with hope. Goals drive both pathways and willpower. Goals can be in the short term, or goals can be in the long term. From the moment you wake up until the moment you go to bed, we are pursuing goals in our life. The question with hope is whether or not we have the ability to identify the pathways or the roadmaps that we can identify of how we're going to get there from here. Pathways thinking is the strategizing piece of hope. Pathways also includes the ability to identify barriers and to engage in the problem-solving process to overcome those barriers or to find alternative pathways. So again, pathways thinking is the strategizing piece of hope. Willpower is really the motivational piece of hope. It's the ability to focus your attention and intention towards those pathway pursuits. So it's really about focusing the mental energy required to engage in pathways, especially during times of adversity. So again, goals, pathways, and willpower. And I'll talk more about these three concepts. Now, when I was visiting with this young man, David, and I came back to the university, and I was really reflecting on what this young man had shared with me, because I had never really thought about the concept of hope before. I'd spent my entire career focused on things like depression and anxiety and isolation. And how do we not only identify those things, but to effectively reduce those? And that is critically important. It is absolutely important. So I want to make sure that we understand that what I'm not advocating is just this positivity that everything, will work out, or we just need to have hope. What we really need to make sure is a more balanced perspective. That is, well-being is more than the reduction of what is wrong with you. While the identification and reduction of depression is critically important, the reduction of depression is not happiness. So what I'm advocating is a more holistic perspective. But when I came back to my office at the university, I actually drew this graph on my chalkboard. And as a quantitative psychologist, I do have a real chalkboard in my office. And what I was reflecting on and what I learned is that in order to be hopeful, we have to have both willpower and pathways. We have to have both. So it might be, for instance, that I have a lot of willpower or energy towards a goal. But if I don't know how to get there from here, we actually consider that to be lower hope, if I don't have the pathways piece. Now, alternatively, it may be that we have the pathways, the strategies by which to achieve the goal. We just don't have the energy. I don't have one more thing to give. Or I may not desire that particular strategy. So in order for hope to be activated, we have to have both pathways and willpower. So as I started to look at this graph and really reflect on the definition of hope, goals, pathways, and willpower, two things really occurred to me. The first thing that occurred to me is I think that the language of hope, goals, pathways, and willpower are one of the best descriptions of the program services in our communities. For instance, school teachers are pathways of hope for children. They are the strategies by which to gain knowledge and education. Our human service nonprofit organizations are pathways of hope for families who are really struggling. So I really started to see the language of hope, again, of the description of programs that exist in our community. Now, the next thing that occurred to me was that this is a different way of thinking about hope than I'm used to. So let's, for a moment, just think about what are some common phrases that we use the word hope. So let's say that you and I pass each other in the hallway. What are some common phrases that we use the word hope? Things like, I hope you're well. I hope you have a great day. Now, I'm in Oklahoma, and so one of the things that's pretty common for us is to say things like, well, I hope there are no tornadoes today. And so when storms come in Oklahoma, which is fairly frequent, I get a lot of willpower. My energy and focus really emerges. And so when I say this word, I hope there are no tornadoes, I certainly have a lot of energy towards that, a lot of willpower, but do I control the weather? Do I have any control over whether or not tornadoes will exist? And the answer is, of course, I don't. And so at this point, what I really want us to understand is the distinction between hoping and wishing. Hoping and wishing. Wishing is when we have a desire for a particular outcome, but there's nothing that we can do to pursue that outcome. Hope is about taking action to pursue the goal. Wishing is passive towards the goal. And this is a really important distinction because most of us use the word hope when what we really refer is a wish. And so outside of this webinar, for instance, you might afterwards go and mention that you listened to this hope talk. And it's important to understand that the people that you're talking to are going to interpret that of, oh, you went to a wishing webinar. And so it's really important for us to understand and to communicate that distinction. Hope is a framework for action, goals, pathways, and willpower. Now, why does it matter? Why does hope matter? So there are over 2,000 published research studies that demonstrate that our capacity to hope is one of the strongest predictors of well-being for children, for adults, and families. Excuse me. And so, for instance, just a quick summary of this literature, we see that when we nurture hope, we see significant improvements in well-being, emotional regulation, coping strategies, improved sense of connectedness. I've researched improved parent-child relationships around hope. When we nurture hope, we see improved pain tolerance and more compliance to treatment outcomes. There's a really robust body of evidence in education that is very interesting. And it demonstrates that when we nurture hope, we see significant improvement in attendance, grades, graduation rates, improved social emotional learning and engagement. There are now a number of publications at the university level that demonstrates that a child's capacity for hope is a better predictor of first-year college performance than standardized testing or high school grade point averages. Hope matters in this context. Now, it's also a good opportunity for me to highlight that in all of the work that I do with organizations and training around this concept of hope, that hope is not the outcome. Hope is the process, and well-being is always the outcome that we focus on. Hope provides that framework for action. So, for instance, the resilience literature tells us that every child needs a positive adult in their life. Hope tells us how to be that positive adult in that child's life. If a child makes a future-oriented statement like, I want to join the school band, that's a future expectation. And so now it's time for us to help that youth engage in the pathways, strategies by which to achieve that goal. Again, hope is a framework for action. So one of the things that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on is to think about how does trauma and adversity influence our capacity for hope. And so this is what we've been studying and looking at other research literature, but this is a specific interest of mine and at the university's Hope Research Center. And this first bullet to me is probably one of the most profound discoveries that we've learned. And that is when you and I are experiencing adversity, we are much more likely to set goals that are avoidant in nature. But when we nurture and restore hope, we see a transition towards an achievement mindset. Let me give you a quick example of the differences between these. So imagine that a basketball player steps out on the court and their mindset is, I want to get the ball and shoot the winning shot for the team. That's an achievement mindset. But imagine that same basketball player who steps out on the court and their mindset is, I hope they don't throw me the ball because I'm probably going to lose it and really disappoint my team. That's an avoidant mindset. But the significance is consider how those two basketball players behave on the court. And what we learn is that the nature of our goals drives our pathways, strategies. The other thing we've learned is that we are much better at short-term goal setting than long-term goal setting, especially in the presence of adversity. So when a child or a family is experiencing adversity and we go up and say, oh, what are your goals? For a family, a child, or an adult who is really just trying to survive, that question has no meaning. So what we have to do is focus on what are the goals today? What are the things that we need to work towards this week? Short-term goal setting. What we've also found is that during adversity, we experience urgency, a sense of urgency that really detracts from our ability to think about pathways. In fact, we're more likely to engage in rash decisions during this time of pathways thinking. The willpower piece to me is really fascinating. So this follows research where there's roughly about 600 published studies around self-control, self-regulation, and this idea of willpower. And the first big takeaway is to recognize that willpower is a limited resource. That is, your and my mental energy is limited. We only have so much mental energy to give. And throughout the day, we are depleting that willpower. The second thing that is interesting in this research is showing a connection between glucose in our system and willpower. Now, as we all know, glucose for us is our source of energy. And when that glucose starts to be depleted, so too is our willpower. Now, the problem with this, the fact that willpower is a limited resource and influenced by glucose, is this idea that nutrition matters, right? But part of the problem is that willpower is strongly associated with self-regulation. And so when willpower is depleted, so too is our capacity to regulate our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So that's kind of how trauma and adversity influence this concept of hope. So what I'd like for us to do real quick is I'll take us through a hypothetical example of how goals, pathways, and willpower all come together, all intersect together. And so what I'd like for us to do is to use a hypothetical example that I think all of us can engage in. First of all, what I would like to ask for those of you in the audience is how many of you know how or have ever attempted to drive a manual transmission vehicle? Now, not everybody has had this experience, but for those of us who have had the opportunity to attempt to drive a manual transmission vehicle, what I'd like for you to do is to just remember that very first time, that very first experience that you had. I want you to remember the anxiety, the fear, the excitement of trying to figure that out. Now, for those of you who've never had that opportunity, I'm sure that in movies or other scenarios, you've actually seen that done. So you know there's this let the clutch out and all of that. So the first thing I'm going to ask is, can you picture this vehicle in your mind, whether you've driven one or not, but can you just picture a vehicle that has a manual transmission? Can you imagine it in your mind? Can you see the pedals on the floor, the gas, the brake, and the clutch? And can you see the gearbox? Can you imagine yourself sitting in the driver's seat? And then ultimately, can you just imagine, even if it's luck, can you just picture and imagine that you're driving down the road? And in our training, in our curriculum, this is part of a guiding principle that imagination is the instrument of hope. And a big part of goals, pathways, and willpower is that we have to help people cast a vision of what the future is going to be. We can set the goal, but let's begin to cast that vision of what success is going to look like. That is going to elicit the willpower to engage. All right, so we're going to drive this manual transmission vehicle for the very first time. And I'm going to put two small pieces of adversity into this hypothetical scenario. First and foremost, you're parked uphill. You're parked facing a fairly steep incline, so that when you let the clutch out, you have to go up this hill. The second small piece of adversity, there's a brand new BMW parked immediately behind you. So whenever you let this clutch out, you've got to go uphill, and you've got this brand new BMW parked behind you. So in that moment, as you start to let the clutch out, going uphill, brand new BMW behind you, as you slowly let that clutch out, what I want you to think about is, what is your goal in that minute? And oftentimes what people will tell me is, don't hit the BMW, don't stall the car. Now, what I want you to understand is that that's an avoidant goal. And so it's just natural for us when we're in stress and adversity to go into this avoidant space. What I also want you to recognize is not hitting the BMW is a good goal, okay? In that moment, it is a good goal. The problem is, where is it coming from? And it's coming from a sense of fear and uncertainty. So we don't want to stay there. So let's say you let the clutch out, you stalled the engine, you didn't hit the BMW, but you killed the engine. So our immediate reaction is going to be things like, oh, I can't do this. I'll never be able to figure this out. And this is the self-talk of a lower hope scenario. But what I also want you to recognize, for those of us who've had this experience, is why we didn't give up. And why we didn't give up is because we desire the goal. We wanted to drive. And this is really important because we have to recognize that it's their goal, not our goal for them. They have to desire the outcome. So let's say that you start the car back up, you let the clutch out, and you lurch uphill. You're successful. You're driving. So the third time you get in the car going uphill, you let the clutch out and you kill the engine again. But this time, what I'd like for you to think about is, what are you saying to yourself now in this moment of failure? And it may be something like, well, I've done it before, I can do it again. And what this reflects is another one of our guiding principles, which is hope begets hope. Hope begets hope. So this one opportunity for success that we've had in the past helps us understand that the future is possible. Even if it's luck, it's still possible. And it's shifting the mindset from the I can't to the I can. And so pretty soon we learned to drive. Now, this is the pathways component. And so the next piece is, how well can you manage your willpower? And what we have to understand is, and we have to remember, that when we're first letting that clutch out, it requires all of our attention. We have to be able to focus all of our energy on that process. The problem is that willpower is a limited resource. And so oftentimes people are experiencing all of these detractors that detract our capacity to focus our willpower on those pathway pursuits. And this is how hope starts to get interrupted. All right, so one of the things I'd like for you to to reflect on. I ask this question at every presentation I give. But, and if you don't mind, please type it into the comment box. But what is the opposite of hope? What is the opposite of hope? And I've asked this question in all over the United States and various countries that I've been to, and the response is typically the same. And that is oftentimes people will respond despair. That despair is the opposite of hope. It's the most common response that I get. However, the opposite of hope is apathy. The opposite of hope is apathy. So the loss of hope is actually a process. So when we begin to experience barriers, we have an emotional reaction of anger, frustration, anxiety. And the harder and more difficult the barrier becomes, we can begin to experience a sense of urgency that we're going to have to hurry up and figure this out. If we're unable to overcome the adversity, we can transition into despair. Now, despair is still an important part of hope because with despair, I still have a lot of willpower or mental energy towards that thing that I cannot have. And the problem with despair is that it can transition into desperation. And in desperation, we can grab a hold of pathways that are very dysfunctional or unhealthy. Ultimately, apathy is the opposite of hope. And in apathy, our basic perspective is looking at a goal or potential pathway through the idea that no matter what I do, I'm going to fail, so why try? The good news is we know how to nurture hope. We know how to do this process. And in other research studies, other researchers, and in our curriculum, we can see a statistically significant increase in hope in about 60 minutes. We know how to nurture this process. So nurturing hope with children and adults follows the same process of setting goals, identifying what the goal is, why it matters. Is it an achievement? Is it an avoidant goal? What is goal success going to look like? And then once we identify the goal, then we begin the experience of trying to identify the viable pathways. And it may be that there are multiple pathways, but some pathways have more barriers than others. So it allows us to practice that pathways thinking. Now, I'm a big fan personally of once we identify the goal and the pathway, is to engage in that process of creating future memories of success. That is beginning to reflect and imagine what could be. And these are the simple strategies we use to nurture hope. Sorry, I clicked that a little too fast. So basically it follows this process of introducing hope, the basic definition, and that it's different than wishing, and to introduce its three main components. And then we simply engage in the goal setting, pathways, and willpower part. So again, simple strategies on how to do this. In some context, it's much more difficult. Doing hope work when somebody's experiencing apathy and despair is much harder when people are already experiencing success. But we're doing those strategies in the various organizations and spaces that we're working with. So that concludes my introduction to hope, to the science of hope. And so now I believe we have a little bit of time for some Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Hellman. Before we start with the Q&A, I want to just touch back on our results from the poll question we asked at the outset, which was, what is one big goal for you or your child in 2024? And then on a scale of 1 to 5, how hopeful do you feel that you will achieve this goal? And 2 goals rose to the top. to use time more wisely and to strengthen relationships, which is really wonderful to see. Much less response to the sort of standard goals we think of: exercising, losing weight, eating more healthy. Those are in there. But in this crowd, strengthening relationships and using time more wisely. So on both accounts, we thank you for being here today, because that is exactly what we are trying to do. And how hopeful do you feel? This group is right around, 3 was the most common. More than a third of people said on a scale of 1 to 5, they feel 3. But overall, we're more hopeful than not. So there were, I'm going to do some quick math here, 70, oh my goodness, 80% of people, even more, 85, felt more hopeful than not. So I feel like we are off to a good start already. And on that, I wanted to just share, because we had so many wonderful interpretations of hope that were contributed by people live in the audience today. And I want to just share a few of those at the outset. One interpretation of hope: hope gives me the ability to not give up. I thought that was a lovely one. And let me, toggle over to, I want to get the wording just right, because these were very well thought out. Hope is taking comfort in your belief that you can. Also very nice. And the last one, where are you? You're hiding from me. I'll have to come back to it. It was lovely. I saved it and now it's missing. So a lot of people have obviously thought very, very deeply about this, and you've provoked them to do even more today. So that's wonderful to see. So I wanted to go into some questions regarding specifically the executive function deficits that are inherent in ADHD, and how those might complicate this process of recognizing goals, but more acutely of defining those pathways. And we know that the executive functions impacted by ADHD include the ability to plan and prioritize, use your time wisely. So a lot of people here feeling like they are fighting even more of an uphill battle. Can you, in your experience working with different populations, offer some insight into how specifically the neurodivergent brain might approach that part of the puzzle?
Sure. So there's not quite as much research on hope in this context of ADHD. However, the research that does exist is really in 2 spaces. One is when we nurture hope, we see improvements in coping strategies. We see improvements in self-esteem, some reductions in depression and anxiety. Some of the common sort of reactions to a life of kind of that adversity in our systems that push back against that. There's also a little bit of a body of research of really doing hope strategies for caregivers, and really making sure that we nurture hope. Because one of the things that I firmly believe in, it's a kind of a Brene Brown moment, but you can't give what you don't have. And so it's really important, I think, for parents, for caregivers, grandparents, teachers, that we have to nurture their hope as well in this space. Now, with this idea of executive function, clearly very important. I'm actually involved right now in some brain scan studies. We've got a little over 6,000 brain scans around hope and the location of the structures of the brain. Clearly, it's going to be in the prefrontal cortex, and in particular, some areas where we see hope activated, it actually mitigates where anxiety is actually fired. So a little bit of brain research there. Now, the issue of, issues of planning, impulse, self-control, those kinds of functions leads us into figuring out some of those strategies to create environments that are conducive to not being overwhelming of all of the different distractors. So, thinking about the environment or the built environment as a way to nurture hope. But to really get down to trying to answer the question is we really start to focus then on much smaller increments of time. To be able to go in and say something like, what are your goals? Hope is about goals, pathways, willpower. And in my brief presentation, I talked about hope in a global fashion. And in this context of ADHD and some of the other spaces that I work in, we have to become much shorter in our time focus, like developing goals for this week or goals for today, or even goals for this hour. Now, we may also need to get even more specific of goals in the context of, say, family, goals in the context of work or education or health. So getting domain specific and doing those willpower strategies. I've also published about 4 studies looking at mindfulness practice as a way to settle the mental processes so that we can focus on that willpower. Not as much research in the area of the question, but some of the research suggests that there are strategies that we can build in that context.
Wonderful. I think it's fascinating what you shared about the areas of the brain associated with hope, mitigating those with anxiety. And it just reinforces what you said about hope begetting hope in a way. That anxiety can get in the way, as we see so often. Anxiety is highly comorbid with ADHD, and that it can get in the way of setting the goals and also identifying and sticking with those pathways.
Yeah, that's why we were really interested in mindfulness practice, yoga. So I've been working in some progressive schools and some alternative schools where mindfulness practice and yoga is in breathing and other strategies are really focused on kind of settling again the willpower piece so that we can focus on those pathway strategies. And this idea of hope begets hope, I think, is a critical principle. Start small incremental steps, and success is going to nurture that hope.
Mm-hmm. Right. So break down those goals of improving relationships. Think about what's one goal for, as you said, today, this week, maybe this month, and building on it. It builds on what you shared, that experience of success makes success more likely as you move forward. And a number of people wondering about if the overlap with the growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset, something that I think that several educators in our audience today are asking about. And if there's overlap here with the two, and anything that educators can take away. I feel like they've been working a little bit more in promoting a growth mindset, and wondering if that will have an impact on hope in education.
Yeah, so I start to look at the existing curriculum, for instance, growth mindset perspective. There are a number of other curriculum strategies, and those, from my perspective, are pathways really to goal attainment. So, when I work with teachers or case managers, counselors, others, it's really starting to look at the idea that the language of hope is a pretty good description of some of the things you're already doing. And so what we really need to do is recognize the three components and to do those things with intention. So when I work in school districts, when we begin to introduce hope, it's not necessarily about creating one more thing you get to do. It's how do we infuse it in what you're already doing.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. We've got a number of questions here today from the parents of teenagers, and specifically wondering about fostering hope in the midst of quite a bit of apathy. So someone wrote in to say that their teenager went from straight A's to a failing student. They're experiencing anxiety and depression. They start to set small goals, but it snowballs. They feel like they can't keep up the energy to sustain the goals. And then they feel like it's pointless. Why should I even try? And I'm kind of seeing, echoes of this throughout the questions here today.
Sure.
Can you offer some help to these parents of adolescents?
Yeah. So we've created some infographics and sort of parent guides of working with youth, both really elementary age, pre-K, elementary, middle school age, and then more high school transitional ages. The core components of goals, pathways, willpower remains consistent. The way in which you do those can depend on those strategies. One task that we've seen some success in both Northern California and Washington with some school districts is really starting to take advantage of some of the real strengths that our youth have, especially around technology. And so, one quick example, it probably doesn't get into all the nuances of the questions that you have, but it's worth in this Northern California and Washington. What these groups are doing, that's teachers and some after school programs, but it's basically introducing the concept of hope, and you can do that in about 20 minutes. What is hope? How is it different from wishing? What are its three major components? But then asking youth to take their smartphone, or you can do this with magazines or pictures on the internet, but to find symbols of goals that they might have. And say, find 5 pictures or that symbolize a goal that you have. And then you come back and you talk about each of those pictures and goals and prioritize them, pick one. You can have this conversation about achievement, avoidance, etc. And then go and have up to 3 pictures that may symbolize pathways to the goal that they chose. And maybe write a couple of sentences about how that picture is a symbol to the pathway. Do the same thing with willpower, and at the end, you have a graphic display of hope, goals, pathways, willpower that is a picture, a framework. So, the idea is that goals, pathways, and willpower is the process. What we have to do is figure out the strategy that connects with the youth that we're working with. And we have to remember that it's in the context of their goals. Now, I will tell you that I do a lot of work with foster youth and adjudicated youth and juvenile affairs. And that apathy and despair really changes the nature of these conversations. It is not a one-time conversation. It's not a 5-minute conversation. It's goals, pathways, willpower. And as parents, be attentive to future-oriented statements like, I would like to X, or listen for those future orientation statements, and then begin to have conversations about pathways. So it's just those really small incremental pieces of the conversation. We are actually seeing really significant improvements, and I'm personally interested in despair and apathy in my research.
Mm-hmm. I love the idea of the sort of vision board, for lack of a better term, that you described, because we do find that ADHD brains in particular sometimes need to see things quite visually. And we recommend this sometimes with younger kids with things as simple as, your morning routine, and to present it visually in a way that they can really, it feels more real. So I love that idea for this.
Well, I know we're running out of time, but one thing that parents can also do is, especially with really young children, is to use children's movies. So, for instance, Finding Nemo, I'll kind of date myself, but when Nemo, what is the goal? What was the major barrier that Nemo experienced? And then if you look at all of those children's movies, every movie has the same solution to the barrier, and that is Nemo's friends were the ones that helped overcome the barrier. And so a parent can actually use those movies to have conversations about what are the goals, what are the pathways, how are your friends helpful for you, how can you be helpful for your friends, to really have intentional conversations.
That's great. We got one question that I found was so intriguing. Someone said that in therapy, they had actually been told that their hope was getting in the way of their ability to learn from experience. So in other words, they kept hoping that things would be different without changing their methodology. And they're wondering, is there a way that I can put a positive spin on this attribute that was presented in a quite negative way?
Yeah. So, we use the word hope all the time. And so I think the first thing is to really make sure that, that hope, in terms of being told that it's getting in the way, the idea is that if the goal has a viable pathway, I guess I'm curious because, within therapy, within psychology and psychotherapy, hope is actually one of the common factors. And so, we go into therapy from the framework of things can be better, and there are strategies to do that. And it's a significant component of therapeutic success, along with that therapeutic alliance piece. So, another piece of that is sometimes what is a goal for you may be a pathway for me. And so, having a little bit of conversation about what goal attainment will allow us to do, or to see how that therapeutic process may in fact be a pathway. Maybe that's a way to try to engage in that.
Okay. Wonderful. I do want to wrap up just reminding everyone that Dr. Hellman does have a book that goes into much greater depth on the topic called Hope Rising. And a number of people wondering if you have recommendations for other books or resources for people who want to dive in deeper on this topic.
Yeah, there's a number of really good videos. There's another book by Shane Lopez called Making Hope Happen. And Shane Lopez, who passed away a few years ago, did a lot of work in education and has quite a few YouTube videos. I have a TED Talk. I think Shane also has a TED Talk. But you can actually find quite a few materials. If you Google things, I would specifically put in the science of hope. Otherwise, you're going to get such a wide variety of resources. I will tell you one final resource is Gallup. Gallup's website, they actually have a behavioral science unit that focuses on hope. So a lot of really good resources there.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness. Dr. Hellman, thank you so much for joining us today and introducing us to this really rich concept of the power of hope. We so appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Your comments and feedback were very much appreciated and really helped to steer this conversation. If you would like to access event resources from today, visit attitudemag.com, search podcast 486, or just click on the episode description wherever you stream your podcasts. And the slides and recording will be available for you to share and rewatch in just a few hours. We hope to see you again. Our next free webinar next week is on seasonal affective disorder and how it uniquely affects people with ADHD. So to make sure you don't miss any upcoming webinars, articles, anything, research updates, check out attitudemag.com/newsletters and sign up. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.